Northern Norway, December 1941. The German Naval High Command, the Oberkommando der Marine, had formally assessed the Arctic sea lanes, particularly those extending to Murmansk and Archangel, as inherently impassable for sustained Allied convoy operations during the winter months. This declaration, disseminated through internal memoranda and operational directives, presented a strategic bedrock for naval deployments in the high north, effectively dictating that significant surface assets could be concentrated elsewhere or reserved for more conventional Atlantic engagements. The stakes were immense. A miscalculation here meant a direct supply line to the Soviet Union, potentially altering the Eastern Front's grim calculus. The primary architect of this assessment, Conter-Admiral Erich Raeder's Chief of Naval Operations Staff, Kapitän zur See, Kurt Fricke, had personally overseen the collation of meteorological and hydrographic data. His office, a stark room within the Marine Oberkommando der Nordsee headquarters in Wilhelmshaven, had processed years of pre-war shipping logs, U-boat patrol reports from the immediate war period, and even historical whaling vessel accounts. These documents, comprising thousands of individual entries, detailed ice formation patterns, prevailing wind directions, and recorded sea states above the 70th parallel. Fricke's analysis, summarized in a 38-page report dated November 22, 1941, concluded that the combination of perpetual darkness, hurricane-force winds, and the rapid, unpredictable formation of pack ice rendered coordinated escort and merchant vessel navigation functionally impossible for any large-scale, regular traffic. The report cited specific instances from late 1940 and early 1941 where individual Soviet trawlers had been lost to ice compression or capsized in gales, extrapolating these isolated incidents to the vulnerability of an entire convoy. The technical examination highlighted the limitations of contemporary navigation equipment in such conditions, particularly the magnetic compass deviations at high latitudes and the nascent radar systems. Reduced efficacy against heavy precipitation and sea spray. The report did acknowledge the theoretical possibility of isolated, heavily armed icebreakers forcing a passage, but dismissed this as impractical for a fleet of 30 to 40 merchant ships. Production logs from German shipyards confirmed that no Allied nation possessed a sufficient number of dedicated ice-hardened cargo vessels or escorts to maintain such a route with any regularity. The strategic implication was clear. The Arctic route was a logistical dead end for the Allies, an assumption that profoundly shaped German naval resource allocation, diverting U-boats and surface raiders to the more temperate and supposedly more lucrative hunting grounds of the mid-Atlantic. This official German position, while grounded in a meticulous, if ultimately flawed, interpretation of environmental data, provided a comforting illusion of security. It permitted the Kriegsmarine to operate with a reduced presence in the far north, believing the elements themselves were a sufficient deterrent. The quiet hum of the teletype machines confirming this assessment resonated through the high command, a testament to the perceived triumph of reasoned analysis over the harsh realities of a global conflict. The German High Command, particularly Admiral Dönitz and his U-boat arm, viewed the Arctic theater with a mixture of strategic disdain and tactical opportunism. Their initial assessment, recorded in internal memoranda from late 1941, characterized the Barents Sea as inherently hostile to sustained naval operations, a judgment heavily influenced by its severe weather patterns and the extended periods of darkness or perpetual daylight. This environment, they reasoned, would naturally limit the effectiveness of large surface combatants and even hinder coordinated U-boat attacks, thereby reducing the necessity for a substantial German naval presence. The deployment reflected this assessment. A relatively small force of U-boats, typically fewer than 10 at any given time, was assigned to the Arctic. These boats, primarily Type 7s, were robust but not designed for the extreme cold and ice-prone waters they encountered. Their hydrophones often struggled against the cacophony of ice movement, and their diesel engines, while reliable, demanded constant maintenance in the frigid air, leading to a higher rate of mechanical failures compared to operations in the Atlantic. Production logs from Kiel and Wilhelmshaven indicated that while U-boat construction ramped up significantly through 1942, the majority of new vessels were earmarked for the Atlantic happy time and subsequent convoy battles. Only a fraction, approximately 8% of the total operational fleet, saw service in the northern waters. This allocation underscored a strategic prioritization, where the disruption of transatlantic supply lines to Britain held far greater weight than interdicting the nascent, though growing, flow of materiel to the Soviet Union via Murmansk and Archangel. The strategic implication was clear. Germany believed the Arctic convoys were a secondary threat, operating in a self-limiting environment. They gambled on the brutal climate and the perceived logistical difficulties of the Allies to deter or sufficiently degrade these convoys without committing significant resources. This underestimation of Allied resolve and adaptability, coupled with an over-reliance on environmental factors, shaped the initial German response. This calculated minimalism left the door ajar, however, for any determined Allied effort to exploit the perceived weakness. Iceland, July 1942, the Allied convoys PQ-17 and PQ-18 began their perilous journey to Arkhangelsk, their holds crammed with the sinews of war, a desperate lifeline to the embattled Soviet Union. Each ship carried a vital cargo, from crated P-39 Airacobras and Sherman tanks to raw aluminum and high-octane aviation fuel, all destined for a front where the sheer volume of materiel could decide the course of the Eastern Front. The stakes were immense. Failure meant not only the loss of irreplaceable supplies, but a profound blow to Allied morale and a potential weakening of the Soviet war effort at a critical juncture. The ships themselves, a diverse collection of merchant vessels, were not built for Arctic warfare. Their hulls, designed for calmer waters, would soon contend with pack ice and gale-force winds, conditions that stressed seams and tested the integrity of their cargo lashings. Naval architects had considered the structural demands of North Atlantic crossings, but the sustained battering of the Arctic Circle presented an entirely different set of challenges, particularly for vessels already loaded to their maximum displacement. PQ-17, the earlier of the two, comprised 35 merchant ships, protected by a formidable escort of 21 warships, including destroyers, corvettes, and minesweepers. This impressive naval force, a testament to the strategic importance of the convoys, was designed to deter submarine and air attacks, providing a multi-layered defense against the anticipated German onslaught. The sheer scale of the escort reflected the intelligence assessments of German naval strength in Norwegian waters, particularly the lurking threat of heavy surface units like Tirpitz. PQ-18, following in September, was similarly robust, with 39 merchant vessels and an even larger escort of 40 warships, including the first dedicated escort carrier, HMS Avenger, providing crucial air cover. The inclusion of an escort carrier marked a significant tactical evolution, attempting to counter the Luftwaffe's long-range reconnaissance and bombing capabilities that had plagued earlier convoys. This strategic shift acknowledged the limitations of land-based air support in the far northern latitudes. The intelligence gathered from signals intercepts and reconnaissance flights indicated a significant concentration of German naval and air assets in Norway, specifically around Narvik and Trondheim. German U-boats, operating from bases along the Norwegian coast, formed a deadly cordon across the expected convoy routes, their acoustic homing torpedoes a constant, unseen menace. Luftwaffe bomber squadrons, primarily Heinkel HE-111s and Junkers Ju-88s, were poised to strike, their crews briefed on the high value of the Allied targets. The German Naval Command, confident in their defensive posture and the perceived impregnability of their northern flank, had issued reports declaring the sea lanes too hazardous for sustained Allied operations. These assessments, based on observed weather patterns, U-boat patrols, and the perceived vulnerability of merchant shipping to coordinated air and sea attacks, formed the basis of their strategic planning. The belief was that the Arctic environment itself, combined with their concentrated forces, would render any large-scale convoy attempt suicidal. The convoys, however, pushed forward, a testament to the Allied commitment to maintaining the flow of supplies. Each ship carried not just materiel, but the hopes of a front desperately in need, navigating a route declared impassable by an enemy convinced of its own strategic foresight. The ice-choked waters and the ever-present threat of attack were simply obstacles to be overcome. The Barents Sea, late 1942. The ice-choked waters, already a formidable adversary, became a gauntlet of steel and fire for the convoys. German naval intelligence, relying on their assessments of the weather patterns and the perceived efficacy of their aerial reconnaissance, had largely dismissed the sustained viability of these northern routes for heavy Allied shipping. Yet the convoys continued to push through. U-boat command's operational logs from this period reveal a stark increase in patrol deployments along the projected convoy lanes, indicating a tactical shift from initial complacency. The Type 7 U-boats, the workhorses of the German submarine fleet, with their 8,700 nautical mile range and 4 bow torpedo tubes, became the primary hunters. Their acoustical homing torpedoes, the G7Es, though still in early deployment, added a new dimension of threat, designed to lock onto the propeller cavitation of the merchant ships. Damage reports compiled by the Admiralty detail the grim toll. Convoy PQ-17, for example, saw 24 of its 35 merchant vessels sunk, a loss rate of 68.5%. Predominantly to U-boat attacks following the dispersal order. This catastrophic event, while an outlier in its scale, underscored the brutal effectiveness of coordinated submarine assaults when air cover was insufficient or withdrawn. Subsequent convoys, though better protected, still faced persistent attrition. The Luftwaffe's contributions to the assault were equally relentless. Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condors, operating from Norwegian airfields, provided long-range reconnaissance and, when opportunity arose, direct bombing attacks. Their 3,000-pound bomb load, combined with their ability to loiter for extended periods, made them a constant menace. Junkers Ju-88s, more versatile and faster, often followed up on Condor sightings, pressing home torpedo and dive bombing runs against the slow-moving columns of ships. Naval archives record numerous instances where merchant ships, already damaged by torpedoes, were then subjected to aerial strafing, further hindering rescue efforts and increasing casualties. The psychological strain on the crews, enduring days of continuous threat from above and below the frigid waves, was immense. Survivors' testimonies frequently recounted the chilling sight of flares dropped by condors, illuminating the convoy for U-boat wolfpacks below. The German strategic objective was clear: sever the supply line to the Soviet Union, thereby crippling the Eastern Front's ability to resist. The sheer volume of materiel transported, however, even with heavy losses, defied their calculations. Production logs from Soviet factories confirm that critical components, machinery, and raw materials from the Arctic convoys continued to feed their war effort, albeit at a reduced and often delayed rate. The route, though perilous, was not closed. The shattered ice fields of the Kola Inlet, late November 1942. The remnants of convoy QP-15 and JW-51B, battered but unbowed, began to trickle into Murmansk and Archangel. The grim arithmetic of the Arctic route was starkly evident in the diminished silhouettes against the gray northern sky. Of the 35 merchant vessels that had set out in the combined convoys, 13 were now gone, swallowed by U-boats, aircraft, or the unforgiving sea. Damage reports from the surviving ships detailed hulls scarred by near misses, superstructure riddled with shrapnel, and engine rooms pushed to their breaking point. The destroyer Acades, for example, limped into port with its bridge completely destroyed and its forward section awash, a testament to the sustained aerial assaults and torpedo attacks it had endured. Its crew, exhausted and frostbitten, had fought for days to keep the vessel afloat and on course. Despite these losses, the sheer volume of material that did arrive represented a strategic victory. Over 200,000 tons of vital war supplies, including tanks, aircraft, trucks, and ammunition, were unloaded onto Soviet docks. This influx, though costing a significant portion of the convoy, still constituted a critical lifeline, bolstering the Red Army's capabilities on the Eastern Front at a time of immense pressure. Interrogation files of captured German naval officers, later compiled by Allied intelligence, revealed a consistent underestimation of the convoy's resilience. One U-boat commander, after being rescued from his sinking vessel, reportedly stated, "We believed the route was impassable for such large formations." This perception of invincibility, cultivated by early successes and the brutal conditions, had been a cornerstone of their tactical planning. The breakthrough of these convoys, however costly, forced a reevaluation within the German High Command. The sustained Allied commitment, despite the clear and present dangers, demonstrated a strategic resolve that transcended the immediate tactical victories of U-boats and bomber squadrons. It underscored the fact that the Arctic lifeline, though perilous, would not be severed entirely. The supplies, once unloaded, were immediately shunted onto the Trans-Siberian Railway, disappearing into the vast Soviet interior to fuel the grinding war machine. The arrival of these goods, particularly the tanks and aircraft, allowed for the re-equipping of frontline units and the establishment of new reserves, directly impacting the balance of power in subsequent offensives. The cost in human lives and tonnage was immense, a heavy price paid in the frigid waters and under the constant threat of attack. Yet, the very fact that a significant portion of the convoys had completed their journey, delivering their vital cargo, represented a profound defiance of the German declaration that the route was safe for their own operations and impassable for the enemy. The Admiralty's reevaluation of the Arctic route's viability began with a meticulous analysis of the convoy PQ-18's transit, specifically focusing on the discrepancy between intelligence assessments and operational outcomes. Initial reports from U-boat commanders and Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights had consistently underestimated the convoy's defensive strength and the tenacity of its escort, leading to a dangerous overconfidence within the German naval command. This divergence between expectation and reality demanded a comprehensive internal audit of intelligence gathering and interpretation protocols. Interrogation files from captured British airmen and merchant sailors, previously dismissed as propaganda or incomplete, were now re-examined with renewed urgency. The consistent accounts of effective anti-aircraft fire and coordinated escort maneuvers, initially downplayed, began to paint a clearer picture of the convoy's robust defenses. These individual testimonies, when collated, revealed a pattern of well-drilled naval cooperation that had not been fully appreciated in earlier threat assessments. The technical examination extended to the performance of German weaponry and tactics against the Allied convoy formations. Damage reports from U-boats returning to base, detailing sustained anti-submarine efforts and the deployment of advanced sonar, indicated a significant improvement in Allied ASW capabilities. Production logs for depth charges and torpedoes, alongside expenditure rates, provided a quantitative measure of the intensity of the engagement, far exceeding previous encounters. Operational directives issued by the Kriegsmarine High Command in the wake of PQ-18 reflected a stark shift in strategic thinking. The previous declaration of the route as safe based on perceived vulnerabilities and a belief in overwhelming German air and sea superiority, was rescinded. New orders emphasized caution, increased reconnaissance, and a more conservative approach to engagement, acknowledging the formidable challenge posed by the Arctic convoys. This forced reassessment carried significant ideological implications, as it challenged the pervasive narrative of German military invincibility in the Northern Theater. The realization that even well-coordinated attacks could be repelled by determined Allied resistance introduced a new element of uncertainty into future operational planning. The Arctic remained a crucible, its waters now understood to be far from a guaranteed hunting ground. The German Naval Command, reviewing the intelligence gathered from the recent convoy actions, recognized a critical vulnerability in their northern flank. Initial assessments, based on U-boat patrols and aerial reconnaissance, had consistently underestimated the Allies' capacity for sustained operations in the high Arctic, leading to a dangerous complacency within certain sectors of the Kriegsmarine. The successful passage of multiple convoys, despite declared interdiction efforts, forced a reevaluation of both strategic priorities and resource allocation. Damage reports from U-boats and surface vessels, coupled with aerial observation logs, revealed the persistent and often overwhelming escort strength accompanying these convoys. The sheer volume of Allied destroyers, corvettes, and even light cruisers, often operating in concert with carrier-borne aircraft, demanded a more robust response than previously deployed. Production logs from German shipyards, meanwhile, indicated a steady, though not exponential, increase in U-boat construction, providing a limited pool of new assets for deployment. The strategic implication was clear. The Arctic route, once deemed too perilous for sustained Allied resupply, had become a viable, if challenging, lifeline to the Soviet Union. This necessitated a significant shift in naval and air doctrine for the Northern Theater. The German High Command, in response, began diverting a greater proportion of its available naval assets, particularly long-range U-boats and heavy surface units, towards the Norwegian Sea and Barents Sea. Luftwaffe reconnaissance squadrons, previously focused on Atlantic and Western Front operations, found their operational parameters extended further north, tasked with identifying convoy formations and providing targeting data for U-boat wolfpacks. Fuel consumption rates for these extended patrols increased dramatically, straining already stretched logistical chains. The commitment of these forces, however, came at the expense of other theaters, creating new vulnerabilities elsewhere. The shift was not merely quantitative, it involved a qualitative reassessment of tactics. Wolfpack formations were adapted for the unique challenges of Arctic conditions, including extreme cold, limited daylight in winter, and the persistent threat of ice. Training exercises, previously conducted in more temperate waters, began to incorporate simulated Arctic environments, preparing crews for the harsh realities of this new battleground. This increased commitment, while significant, still operated within the constraints of Germany's broader war effort. The resources allocated to the Arctic, though greater than before, represented a calculated risk, balancing the perceived threat of the convoys against the demands of other, equally critical fronts. The cold, unforgiving waters of the far north were transforming into a zone of escalating, attritional warfare. The icy grip of the Arctic winter, coupled with the relentless pressure from German air and naval forces, had failed to sever the lifeline to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. Despite the Kriegsmarine's persistent declarations of the route's inherent dangers, and indeed its periodic successes in sinking merchant vessels, the convoys continued their eastward passage. Interrogation files from captured U-boat commanders often revealed a frustration bordering on disbelief at the sheer tenacity of the Allied effort, frequently citing intelligence estimates that consistently underestimated the convoy's resilience and the speed of their reformation. The strategic imperative for the Soviets, communicated through diplomatic channels and military liaison reports, transcended the immediate losses. Each tank, each aircraft, each ton of raw material delivered was considered a critical increment to the Eastern Front's capacity. British Admiralty shipping manifests indicate that even after the catastrophic losses of convoy PQ-17, the subsequent convoys, though smaller and more heavily escorted, maintained a consistent, if reduced, flow. The average monthly tonnage delivered between September 1942 and March 1943, according to logistical summaries, still registered at 105,000 tons, a testament to the unyielding commitment. German naval intelligence, relying on aerial reconnaissance and U-boat sightings, would frequently report the dispersal or destruction of convoys, only to be contradicted by later reports of ships arriving in Soviet ports. This disconnect between perceived victory and actual outcome fueled a perpetual reevaluation of tactics within Kriegsmarine headquarters. The deployment of additional U-boats and the occasional sortie of surface raiders, such as the Scharnhorst and Lutzow, represented escalating attempts to choke off the supply, yet their operational windows were often limited by fuel constraints and the increasing threat of Allied air cover. The human cost of these continued operations was immense. Medical records from Royal Navy hospitals in Scapa Flow and Iceland detail thousands of cases of frostbite, exposure, and combat trauma among convoy sailors. Yet the steady stream of volunteers for these perilous journeys never dried up, driven by a complex mix of duty, patriotism, and the grim understanding of the Eastern Front's existential struggle. The logistical reports from the Soviet receiving ports detailing the